Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of the Kitabi Karwan Podcast. Before we get started, I just want to give you a small brief about what this podcast is going to be about. It's not going to be a typical podcast reviewing books or giving you ideas which are essentially blurbs of books. What I'm going to do is try and talk to authors about what makes them read, what makes them write, what is it about this entire beautiful world of reading that draws the best out of them creatively. What this podcast wants to do is explore the depth of reading and what makes people read or what connects to them while they read different things. And that's why I'm going to be interviewing different authors, talking to them about their favorite books, what got them into writing, what do they think about certain aspects of reading which you might find interesting. And that's about it. The very first guest for our podcast is Miss Rheea Mukherjee. She's the author of The Body Myth, which was published by Unnamed Press last year. And she's also written a collection of short stories titled Transit for Beginners, which was published by Kitabi in 2016. She has an MFA from the California College of Arts in San Francisco. And she's also dabbled in a variety of things, ranging from being a coffee barista, a counselor, a behavioral health advocate, and an entrepreneur. She also is a vegan and runs an amazing blog for veganism. And at the same time, her website carries all her non-fiction and fiction articles, which I strongly advise all of you to check out. It is something really interesting. Without any further ado, let's jump right in.
So, Rheea, for all our listeners and viewers, I would like you to give us a small introduction and not the one on your website or on your blog. Something that tells us more about you.
I'm a Bangalore-based writer for all practical purposes. But I am this little third culture kid who kind of grew up between the US and India for the longest time. My first 10 years were in the US, and then the next, when I was 10 to 18, I was in Bangalore. So I was a school kid in Bangalore in the 90s. And then my family moved back to the US. And that's another story altogether, my God, my family. But, so I went to college and did my master's over there, worked for a bit. And I moved back to India actually in 2011. So I'm very much a Bangalorean. I run a small content and design firm which pays the bills because fiction does not pay the bills. And and I live with my partner and I have two dogs called Nimbu and Henna, both adopted little dogs.
That's so cute. So, something I really have to ask. Okay, this is one of those reverse Jhumpa Lahiri kind of situations. She's one of my favorite authors, and it's just very unique to see her writing because she's that third culture kid, but set in the US. And it's very refreshing because now that in the 80s and 90s, you've had this explosion of people studying abroad, coming back, and assimilating different cultures that they've learned. So, how does your culture, this change in your cultural approach fit into what you read and what you write? I mean, because you've at very different stages in your life, you've been exposed to very different cultures, and that just offers a unique perspective, which I would want to know.
I think that's a really good question, and it's funny that you mentioned Jhumpa Lahiri because she was, of course, a defining author that I went to when in my 20s when I was reading. And like you said, there was this whole blast of, I think maybe from the mid 90s onwards, this whole blast of Indian diasporic writing that kind of addressed this whole fitting in and, becoming, embracing your Indian identity in an American world. However, that was not my experience because of my shifting in between countries. So I wasn't the typical ABCD, what they call American born confused Desi, who could relate to a lot of the issues that your standard American Indian person could relate to, and so I thought that there was something missing in the writing that I was reading that was coming from Indian writers. And this was a time before Indian English writing really took a huge stand in India, which now it's much more well known. Writers are taking all types of challenges and really embracing their own environment versus before it was either very exoticized writing. It was like you have to talk about arranged marriages and mangoes and pickles, or you
Right.
have to be talking about the immigrant experience only. And so now you can see this whole host of Indian English writing. And obviously, all of these wonderful themes and literary talent was always there in our native languages. We just,
Mhm.
now we can read a little bit of that in translation, because I can't, English is really the only proper language that I can read in. I mean, I can technically read in Hindi, but I can't enjoy a book like the way, and that's a loss for me. That's, a loss of language. But there is so much great literature out there. But in Indian English writing, now I think it's a very exciting time. And so I feel like right now you can, as an Indian writer, you can write about anything and take new risks and really understand that in India, there is no one story. It's a billion stories. And, you can try to take one kind of perspective and put it out there.
So, something that you mentioned, right? Like talking about how in India, you're absolutely right. There are these almost 135 crore people here. Everyone has unique stories, and because of how our country is structured, we just have these unique cultural tastes. And it just pivots me back to a short story I read on your website about. So it's something I don't remember the name of the short story. I apologize, but the character talks about how there's a protagonist and the female lead who talks about how there's this buzzwords which is talked about, which is kind of dismissed as cliquey or like something that's kind of looked down upon. And that's something that I felt is something we should talk about. That we do, I think personally, we are seeing this divide in Indian, let's say, call it the Indian reading scene, wherein you'll have your typical elite upper class people, or like anyone who's been privileged enough to get a good education, to being exposed to Western literature, or something like me mentioning Jhumpa Lahiri, that just drips of the fact of the kind of privilege I've had. And on the other hand, you have the explosion of writers whose work is not typically called literature in that sense. Something like your, I wouldn't name them, but then you do get what I mean. And
Absolutely.
right, and you see this great divide wherein they have stories to tell. These are authentic stories because they click with people. They click for reasons that their language is simple. They click because, well, their stories are well true. And but on the other hand, you have people judging them for like not adhering to this idea of what literature is. That they're, something. I think one of my favorite comparisons is from. I'll actually name the book over here. It's just I was reading Two States. It's one of a fun book that I really like, and where Chetan Bhagat just mentions that he's at his girlfriend's house and he's his mother's cooking and she's Tamilian, and she's like, if this was any other well-written book, I would spend 2 pages talking about how the smell of spices was exotic and something, but it just was burning my eyes. Something that I think that perfectly encapsulate what this divide is. Do you think that, I know, there is any merit to this kind of divide being put out there, that somehow modern Indian writers are not catering to a higher level of writing? Or is it just that, well, they have different stories to tell?
No, I think that the divide is quite unnecessary because it is certainly a part of literature. And the more mainstream it is, the more accessible it is. And I think we have, that's a crisis, if you ask me, if people are going to just alienate mainstream and pulp literature. Like you said, things that are resonating, have this kind of, A to B Bollywood kind of format. Because these are very true emotional kind of understandings that people experience in the country. And you have to remember that most of India is, not sitting in Bombay and Bangalore and Delhi. It's in the smaller towns, and their reality and how they negotiate all this liberal globalization that's happening is very different, can be very different from the way that, we want to examine. Like you said, there's an element of privilege. So it's great that there is literary fiction, but but I have a great respect for what is the mainstream. Like, I personally am a huge fan of Bollywood, and not just because, I'm yes, I mean, I can quote a lot of films and I can, gush about a lot of films, but basically they connect the country. So no matter what, even if you think, oh God, I hate Bollywood and I hate this nonsense and tamasha that goes on, it's still, it's a conversation point that we all can reunite for a moment with a memory of something. Most urban Indians, most small town India will know what DDLJ is.
That's correct.
No matter whether you hate it or not, or you didn't care for it, or whatever it is, it's a connector.
So something that also bothers me is, or not bothers me, just something I think about often is, as you mentioned, that even I come from like a North Indian family, but I know how to speak in Hindi, but I'm not very comfortable reading it. And mere text, I would end up reading it, but I won't enjoy it the same way I enjoy a book written in English.
I get that. Mm-hmm.
And do you think this is affecting the narrative in the sense that people aren't able to get their stories out there, or is language forming an actual barrier at this stage in India's growth as like a society, not as a country?
It is, and I think it's very interesting because I feel like there's a certain population in the country that's actually comfortable reading English, definitely not speaking it, right? Definitely not speaking it. They would feel way more comfortable in their mother tongue, whatever that might be. But because of globalization and this pressure that you have to understand English, or you get this basic English, but you don't have the confidence because you don't have the ecosystems to speak it every day, or to understand it from different perspectives and global pinpoints and whatever. So you can't speak it, but you can read it and you can resonate with that, which is why a lot of English pulpy fiction, of the Chetan Bhagat and that, like there's a bunch of writers who are writing in that league, resonates so much with that. But also you say, like, we're reading, like might not be comfortable reading a literary fiction in Hindi, but I also feel like we're losing out so much in how thoughts are formed, because every language and culture has their own way of perceiving. English is a very limited language, and it's the global aspiration. It's one of the most limited languages in the world. In fact, it is probably the most limiting language in the world, because we just don't have enough words to express different kinds of emotions which other languages have. Like take Urdu for example. Oh my God, you can't even come close to it, right? So I definitely think that by not being able to read different languages, we are also limiting perception, how we can perceive the world. There's so many other ways. So it's a great thing, and my only hope is that for urban elite people like me is that there's a lot of hope in translations, and I'm trying to read more translations, and that at least gives you, I mean, obviously not the whole package, but it allows you to sit in the world for a little bit.
Right. Like, I get what you mean. Like something along the lines of, I was recently reading a collection of short stories by Manto, and I was also reading this collection of poems by Gulzar. And both of them were translated from Urdu into English. And it was very interesting to read the translator's note attached to both of them, because both of them exactly spoke about this, that it's extremely difficult to capture the emotion of Urdu into a limited language as English. But something that you mentioned, perception, and that's something that leads me to what I really wanted to ask you about, was that, so originally, as we spoke about your different growth in different cultures, right? You spent about 10 years in the US, 10 years here. And so I just wanted to know, could you just tell me a couple of books that really hit hard, like, the ones which stayed with you throughout still stay with you and have shaped your journey as a writer?
That's a hard question, because I don't know if there's any. So first of all, let me tell you that I grew up reading. My first things that were really impactful when I was reading was for Reader's Digest, and I think this was there in a lot of middle class India's households. It was always there, and that was really what got me started on reading really religiously in a way. It was Reader's Digest, and then reading things like Jeffrey Archer and Sidney Sheldon. So I didn't really start with like, let's go, literary fiction. I really read a lot of these mainstream things that were kept in a lot of middle class Indian households, whether or not people read them or not. They were just there. Somebody, some uncle, some father, some mother was reading them. And that's what I picked up. And then I remember, one of the first books that really made an impact on me was actually a non-fiction book by Pratima Bedi. And it was called Time Pass. And it was her memoir. Okay, and so Pratima Bedi is, obviously, she was a famous dancer. She founded Nityogram in Bangalore, but she lived life very atypically, coming from a very conservative family in I think she grew up in Calcutta, if I'm not mistaken, and had Marwadi roots. God, I hope I'm right. But she was, she was talking about, how she would get out of the house in the middle of the night to go on to go and meet her boyfriend, and she, she had this honest, raw, emotional vulnerability. And reading this, I think it was at the turn of, like, maybe this must have been 2000 when I read it, or 99 or 2000. Reading it back then and seeing this woman articulate herself so well and so powerfully, and kind of challenging all these kind of gender roles and how, a woman is supposed to be, even though she came from a pretty privileged background, was really, really fascinating for me, because this is, and I grew up in a very, when I was in Bangalore in the 90s, from a very, like, proper, like it was a very, it was a Aurobindo school. It was a Hindu school. It was a very, very authoritative, very, I had a lot of issues. I have a lot of issues with the Indian education system. I keep going on a rant on that on the side. But so, I mean, when you come from that, and that's what you're experiencing at that time, and to read a book like that, I was like, wow, I want to be her, and I want to have that kind of bravery. Right. So that was something that I really took to heart as a writer. So not maybe in terms of the technicalities of writing, but how I wanted to be as a writer, how I wanted to present, how I wanted to connect to people. That's probably the one book that really made a huge mark on me.
Right. Like, it's funny that you mentioned that, because it's more often than not, everyone I know, like, not only writers, it's just anyone who loves to read and somehow has had this one book or a couple of books that have impacted them. And obviously you have different books that impact you at different points in your life. But more often than not, the book that impacts you the most is one that surrounds bravery, that, just kind of pushes you beyond what your boundaries are. Yeah. And it's just a very interesting thing that I've noticed, that somehow all of us as human beings just need that push to be braver in life, and just to follow our dreams and get where we are.
Yeah.
So, again, there's something I wanted to ask you. It's I know how would you respond to it or something. It's just, I think I read it in one of your pieces, when I don't know if it's a biographical piece or whether it's something that you just wrote down, about this girl who got married when she was in her 20s, when she was studying.
That is my memoir. Yeah, that's a true story.
Right.
That's a memoir.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. So, writing about something as sensitive as this, was it a difficult experience? Was it I know what was, how did you end up doing it?
Yeah, so a few things. Like, if you ask me 6 or 7 years, I mean, that piece also I think I wrote 3 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, definitely. But if, from that point when I had actually wrote it, if you had asked me 5 years ago if I would write something like that, I would have said, no, are you crazy? I would never write that. So, and two things, right? One is, a lot of people have a huge discomfort writing about what really happened. So either it comes off as very, like, lush, romanticized angst, right? Angst or victimization, or it comes from, or you fictionalize it. And, and you have to be really careful, because a lot of writers who are starting out, their first novel, or ultimately, the attempt at it becomes a little bit biographical, and you really have to figure out as a writer what you're trying to do with that. Just because it happened to you, how are you still trying to connect with the world with it? Because you can't just put out your stuff there without an understanding of what you're trying to do with it as a writer, as a communicator, if you are writing something like that. So when I wrote that piece for The Lady's Finger, I had evolved a lot. I had realized that so many of my decisions and choices in my life were pre-programmed from socialization, from gender, from homesickness, from cultural disassociation. A lot of these oppressive things we are just born into without us even realizing it. By the time you realize it, you're probably in your 30s, if you're lucky. But but you're born into so many of these random expectations and societal norms, which really are so fear-based and don't make any logical sense in the real world. Which is why books really allow us to connect and say, oh my God, I can feel free for a second, or I can implement this, and I get this push to really see my full potential. And the sadness is that we are really never we're not taught to lead in this country. We're not taught to embrace our uniqueness. We're not taught to have autonomy. And I think when you can tell your own story, not from a place of look at me, look how sad my life is, because that's, I think, a mistake a lot of writers make, but from a point of empowerment, from a point of perspective, and from a point of trying to connect it to the larger world. So when I wrote that piece, I was 33 years old, and it was about 11 years since that incident happened, since my first marriage. And so then that amount of time had really established who I was, how open I am about my life and how I see it. That's a continuous process, and I think once you embrace a certain amount of freedom, you just get freer and freer and freer, because everything else is just fear based. It's about people will look at you this way. People, I mean, even in your question, you were very hesitant to ask me why, because society has told you that it's a very dicey question to ask. It comes from fear.
Right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean,
and it's true. Like, most people will probably react weirdly to it. I'm definitely. I mean, I definitely understand where that comes from. But I'm saying it's a learned thing, because we're all very fear-based individuals. And so the more you let go of that, you realize it really doesn't matter. A, and two, it actually creates a lot more change, because that was one of my most powerful essays. Not because that it didn't take me a long time to write. When the time was right, it came out. But I got over hundreds of responses in my inbox from women who just resonated with this in so many different ways, and that was really amazing to see.
Coming back to Taboos and the book that came out last year, The Body, something that stood out for me in the book was how unstructured, chaotic, yet normalized it was. That is how it just felt real, in the sense that people don't often have those exact thoughts how they're structured in books. It's just chaotic, unorganized. That's how people function and go about doing their things, or how they interact with people, or how there's this manipulation. So something that I wanted to know was, what was the process that went behind The Body Myth? Like, how did the book come to you? Was there did something happen that made you get the idea, or did it just come to you? How did you develop these characters as such?
It was actually it was my third attempt at writing a novel, actually. The first one really didn't end up going anywhere. The second one, I thought I had a better idea, but I lost interest in it, which is always a bad sign, because when you lose interest in your own work, it's really a bad sign. So then I took this break, and then one day in like late 2016, this idea about this woman possibly faking an illness came to me. So this character Sarah really came to me, who was kind of falling in line with that, but also at the same time subverting it in some way. Right. And so once this idea kind of struck, the novel really came to me really quickly. It's really weird. Now, so some people say, how long did it take you to take this novel? It depends how you look at it. One answer is 10 years, because I was writing a lot of other things before I got to this, and it just came out. The other answer for this is 4 months to write the first draft, and then 2 years of editing almost.
The second last question that I wanted to talk to you about was, so The Body Myth also talks about LGBTQ relationships, right? You have, and it talk about them in a much more nuanced manner than, say, a book would do it like about 10 years, 20 years ago. Something that crossed my mind was about, do you think the taboo in India surrounding not just LGBTQ rights, but oppression, or let's say any of our social issues rather, is a problem of language? I think that goes to the crux of why we are progressing quite slowly on that front in terms of normalizing these issues.
That's a really good question. Actually, I think partly we have to remember that like you were saying, that there might not be a word for depression, and I mean not in the sense of the way when we say it, like this person, I have depression, or I have chronic depression. I don't think there's an exact translation in Hindi. I think there are probably different words that would, that have come from a different time, from a different association of what depression means, right? So when we use it in this in this clinical English way, it gets co-opted even in Hindi, because I've heard Hindi speakers also say depression mein aa gaya,
Right.
or they say anxiety also, same. And gay, being gay, people are saying that as they're speaking Hindi.
Right.
So I feel like when you're using those words, a lot of probably the very native speakers who don't access English at all feel like these words are very jarring, and also come from people that they don't understand, or that are these elite weird people or whatever. Like these are naya cheese somehow, some new generation of things.
Right.
And so, what is your first response when you see something that's completely new? It is fear. And I think the easiest thing is when your fear is to attack, which is just makes it easier for a lot of politicians and a lot of people in positions of power to completely maximize that fear by saying this is bad. And then what happens is people's personal insecurities about their own articulation, or maybe I don't know English well enough, or I don't understand these themes well enough because nobody's explained it to them properly. It's just easier to say, yeah, I attack it because I'm insecure, I'm attack it. So that's actually a really splendid point. And yes, I think it does have a part to play, because I feel like if someone sat down and from another generation, even maybe my parents or even my grandparents' generation, if you sat down and you spoke in their native language what this is, in a really soft and nuanced way as best as possible, I feel like they would not a lot more people would be more open to it,
right,
and find a relation to it in their life. Because it's not
right,
like these things are not happening, like maybe that was that when something I knew this person, or maybe this was that,
right.
and then suddenly you made them a part of the conversation instead of making them and I think that's missing in so much rhetoric. We're not making people a part of the conversation. You're trying to be pedantic. This is
Yeah.
also a problem with social justice warriors. You're being very pedantic. You're just going and saying blah blah blah, this is what you have to say, this is how you have to say it, and you have to
Right.
say it at this way, otherwise you're bad, or you're cancelled, or you're ignorant, or whatever.
Right.
So that's hugely problematic as well.
Unfortunately, I'll have to wrap this up right now, but I have one last question for you. It's been a year since the Body Myth came out, and what other works are on the horizon? What can we expect from you over the next year, couple of years?
Actually, I am working on a project right now, so I can't officially say anything because nothing's really happened. But the next project that I'm working on is actually going to be hopefully nonfiction. And it's going to look at the idea of love, but not in the not in the standard definition, and look at the idea of resistance and what it means to be a resistor, to be a citizen, to be someone who can to be capable of much more extraordinary compassion and creative change than you thought possible. So that's
Right.
I know it's a weird summary, but that's what
No,
I'm going to do.
no, that actually sounds really interesting, and that's something I think it'll make for a very interesting read. So I'm really looking forward to it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for being on the podcast and like working on with me for the debut episode. You have no idea how much this means to me. It was really great having you on.
It was a wonderful conversation, such a refreshing conversation. I really hope you do more of these. I'm really looking forward to following more of your interviews and podcasts.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I hope all of you enjoyed this podcast. If you did, and if you want more updates from us, please like and comment and subscribe to our channel and our podcast. And don't forget to check out our website, kitabikarwan.com, and check us out on Instagram @kitabikarwan. The links are in the description. We'll be back with more such episodes and more such interesting authors for you.